Hello everyone and welcome to today's showcase. Before we start, please let me know that you hear me well and you see my screen with my photo and our webinar's title. Okay, thank you so much. So, my name is Anastasia and I'm going to share with you how to automate webinar lead processing, including integration with GoToWebinar without using programming. But firstly, let me say a couple of words. A couple of words about Integros. We are working on Sugar CRM project more than 10 years, and since that, we completed more than 150 CRM projects. And we are not only implement comprehensive CRM solutions, but we also develop ready-to-use Sugar add-ons. And two of them, Timeline Viewer and Logic Builder, you will see during today's showcase. So let's back to our theme. Webinars is a great lead generation channel. And also webinar platforms allows us to make follow-ups. But how we can consider previous communications with our attendees? How we can build our follow-ups considering reaction of attendee on our webinar? Needless to say that CRM is a place where we can aggregate all processed data around lead. And that is why today I'm talking about integration between Sugar and GoToWebinar and to build effective omnichannel marketing solution. So when we are talking about omnichannel environment, there are several typical challenges. First of all, it's providing a seamless communication, especially after standard follow-ups. When we send a message in one channel, response or reaction we can get from another channel that is more convenient for our attendees. But prior this seamless communication, to increase the likelihood of this communication, we have to build personalized message. And I'm talking not about obvious things like name and company, but also consider how our attendee reacts on the webinar. So in order to ensure this seamless communication and increase likelihood of communication, we have to correctly identify webinar participant and obtain all data that we can around this attendee. And so to address this challenge, let's switch to our today's demo. For this, I'm switching to Sugar. And to implement such solution into life, we perform several configurations. The start was through Studio by introducing the new module named Webinars. Currently, you can see it on the screen. It is the place where initial information about webinar is stored. When it started, the name of the webinar, and the quite important part, it is GoToWebinar key. Here it is. When we get this key, it's the trigger to start the whole process of webinar lead processing. This process contains several parts, and first one part, it is a process webinar registrants. So the aim is to get leads into Sugar and also obtain all behavior data about our attendees. This process is built in Sugar BPM, and currently you can see it on the screen. So as I mentioned, it starts when we obtain a webinar key. And then the process or the cycle of collecting all attendees information is started. And you can see the first element, the really small element here, but behind it there is a quite complicated logic of gathering all registrants from the webinar. That is a part when the first step is to connect to the GoToWebinar and retrieve all data about our registrants. We can do this through API. And now, if you think that API it is only it's area where only developers can work, not anymore, because we can connect to the external system, GoToWebinar, and gather data without knowing any programming language. For this, we are using Logic Builder. It is also a designer tool for configuration sugar behavior. So let me quickly just show you how it looks in Logic Builder, the part of connection to the external system, to the GoToWebinar in our case. For this, I'm going to open Logic Builder. Here it is. So all that you currently see on the screen is connection to the GoToWebinar and asking for the registrants for some particular webinar. You can see these bricks, which actually are operators, and combining these operators in special order, we finally do some step. For example, currently on the screen, it is connected to the GoToWebinar to start collecting registrants for further processing. So it's the only first step. In this, let me return to sugar BPM in this small element. Then, obviously, when we get a webinar registrant, we create lead record in sugar for this registrant. But it is not all steps that we want to do with our lead. We want to automate as much as we can. So we start to process our records. First of all, we automate that. We try to find, actually, we design logic for sugar to find whether there is a contact for this lead, for example, by email address. And if we find, or system actually finds this contact, this lead registrant from the webinar will be linked to the existing contact record. If not, we will create the new contact record. After this, we do the quite similar process for accounts. System tries to find account record. For example, on the previous step, we already find contact. We can easily detect account, or otherwise we can search by, for example, email address. So this is steps to enrich data about attendee as much as we can. And all of this, all logic is behind this very small element. And design of this logic was performed in Logic Builder. Let me zoom a little bit out. So here are blocks, and each block performs some step, find contact or create new contact, and so on. And let me return to the sugar BPM. And even this, it is not all the steps that is done in this particular element. The very last step is that if we struggle, actually system struggle to find information, we put human tasks. We create tasks on marketing team to enrich information about our attendee, to find some information in open sources like using hint, for example. It's actually a human task. So that what is done by this first element. And let me show how it looks like in sugar. For this, I return to the webinar record. Here it is. And below, if I scroll down, you can see that here all webinar registrants gathered from the GoToWebinar. And if I scroll down even more, here are all tasks on the marketing team to enrich information. For example, the first task is enrich information about some account, and we try to put some hints for marketing team what they have to do under this task to help them complete tasks more successfully. And such approach approach allows marketing to process tasks easier because we try to automate as much as we can from the one side. And also, all these registrants, they appear in under webinar as soon as new registrant is as soon as someone registered to the webinar. So it is not like once go to webinar, get all information, and here it is all 50 leads. No, and one person registered, for example, to the webinar, and almost immediately there is a lead information into Sugar. Let me return to here, and this lead record goes through all these steps, and if there are some lack of information, important information that we will use in following follow-up, we will create the task on the marketing team. This is a cycle, so Sugar connects to the GoToWebinar and checks for the new registrants until the webinar will be actually conducted. It was the first part of our process to import new leads into Sugar, and then it is the second part of the process. It's quite an unexpected beginning of this second part because from our practice we know that there are a lot of registrants who register actually to the webinar upon the last 2 minutes or even after webinar is already started. So we also want all this information within our webinar records. And again, it is one more round to gather all registrants information from GoToWebinar to Sugar. So the next our part is to process attendance data. Means that webinar is already conducted, so we have to get all information about our attendees, how long they stayed during webinar, whether there are questions, and so on. But firstly, we put a user task again on actually webinar moderator to input some information manually. Why do we do so here? We have some behavior parameters, and one of these behavior parameter is extent of attendance. Means how let me say long attendee was on webinar, whether it's full part, whether partially, or it was just a registration. And to calculate this parameter, we have to know the time of the webinar. Let me switch to the webinar record. Obviously, we can get the webinar start and webinar end data. It is the actual start and actual date of our webinar. But the presentation usually takes a little less time because there is an introduction word, there is a Q&A section. So here system asks moderator to manually input actual information of start of presentation and end of it. So that is what is behind this user task. And then again, the small element behind which there is some kind of complicated logic, because again we start to collect information about our attendees. We go to the GoToWebinar and grab data about how attendee reacts on the webinar, whether there are some grades or whether there are some questions, whether these questions were answered during webinar. So all this information is gathered into the Sugar from the GoToWebinar. And the very last step of this process, it is again a manual task on webinar moderator, and it is about questions on the webinar, because usually during webinar we answered questions in voice, which is not tracked in GoToWebinar as answered question. So we system ask webinar moderator to enter in webinar record which questions were actually answered during webinar and which not. And after this, we say that is end. The webinar is processed. We get all registrants. We get all information about attendees of our webinar. And now let me return to webinar record. And as I mentioned, it is this module was created through Studio to store initial information about webinar. But also through Studio, we extended lead record with several fields to store behavior parameters. Let me show you this. So I open one of attendees record. And as you can see, there is webinar panel. And here it is the place where we store each attendee feedback on the webinar. For example, we see that this attendee put for us quite high mark. There were no questions from this attendee. And also this attendee was on the full webinar. That is data that we get from the GoToWebinar and process. For example, I've told about extent of attendance that we calculates by actual presentation and attendee presents during the webinar. So that was the first part. We get all information about webinar and its attendees. And now it comes to the processing these leads when webinar is completed. It's a part about follow-up. And the part of this follow-up is a personalized message. Let me quickly open my presentation and talk a little bit about personalized messages. What it consists of, how we can say that it is personalized. You can see two sides here. On the left side, there is information about to whom we are writing, whether it is our customer or prospect or partner. Obviously, all these characteristics affect on message that attendee will receive. And also we consider whether it is our first interaction or we already speak before. And on the other hand, on the right side, we consider the attendee reaction on the content of the webinar, whether there were questions or marks. And for example, if it is our customer who asked a question and question wasn't answered, it will be one message. For example, it is our customer as well, but for example, our customer put our mark, that will be another message. So it can be a lot of combination of final message that will be sent to our attendee. And even more, if it is our customer, we also can consider, but probably there is an open case to service, or we have an open opportunity. So there are a lot of let me say, like conditions which influence on final message that will be sent to our attendee. So that is what about message, and let's talk about this follow-up process in whole part. For this, I'll return to Sugar, and follow-up process was built also in the Sugar BPM. And it starts as we get all information about our lead, who is attendee of our webinar. And first step that we do, it is check if enrichment task is closed. There are two sides of this step. First of all, we want to get as much information about our attendee as we can, because all of this information is influenced on message, on content content of the follow-up that our attendee will receive. But from the other side, we can't wait for eternity when marketing team complete this enrichment task because we shoot the follow-up attendee while it is hot. So that's why this part is here, to check whether there is enrichment task, whether it is completed, and if not, we give some reasonable time to complete it. And then, whether it's completed or not, we send a follow-up email. I already show you or talk a little bit what parameters or what characteristic influence on final content of the message that will be sent to our attendee. And actually, it all can be described using if then else logic. And that is why we are leveraging again the logic builder to describe all these conditions that to build final message. I'm just briefly going to show you how to do so, we did it. So again, it is logic builder, and probably you know this white link, which is actually a flow, but you can see that it divides and unifies based on conditions. So for example, let's zoom in on this block. Here we evaluate whether there were some questions during webinar. If there were some questions, we check whether these questions were answered. And based on these three conditions, like whether there were question answered, and question not answered, we put different text in our final message. And there is the thing is that there is not only questions, but for example, grades, how attendee evaluate our webinar. And I've already told about extent of attendance. So there's several parameters which we put here, evaluate the value of these parameters, and input these small pieces of message in our final message. And when it comes about to final message, we have, let me say, around 8 or 9, let me name it a base message. It's like the main body of message, and it depends on attendee type, for example, whether it's customer or partner, and input in this main message different insertions based on the feedback at the webinar. So in Logic Builder, we configure the logic, what should be sent. But when it comes to text, actual text, what attendee will see in follow-up, we are configuring this text in Sugar. Again, let me briefly show you. There is a model logic builder templates, and here you can see there are 17 templates, different combination of which combine a final message to our attendee. Below this follow-up email 0, it's a main body. So for example, let me show you the text. So dear, obviously name. And then you can see, for example, this some kind of variable named grade. It's not actually a one variable. Here, attendee will see, instead of obviously grade word, some text. Depends on how our attendee reacts on webinar. So if attendee put no mark, there will be this text. Could you please access? And like this. If it is a high mark, there will be this text. So it's like not one template which just fills with name and name, okay, but also it will be extended with different pieces of text to get the final really personalized message. So let's return to our follow-up process, because we only sent a message, but it is not the end. We sent a personalized email. We wait for some time, and then we need to get some feedback, check whether there were any reaction. And it is the most complicated part and interesting part as well, because reaction may be not as reply on email, but it can be a call to a manager, or our attendee can go to the website and fill some form, or it can be even meeting, personal meeting with manager. So actual reaction on webinar can be in any channel, not in that channel which we initially follow up. So the thing is here that we have to store all these key events, reaction on the webinar, within Sugar, within our attendee record. And for this, we are using Timeline Viewer. Let me show it. So here is our webinar, lead, our attendee. And on the right side, you can see here is our timeline where all key events are collected about this, in our particular example, attendee. So for example, here you may see that we already sent the webinar follow-up. And then we can check what other activities were after this follow-up. We can see that assignee manager was changed. Also, we can see that lead was postponed at CND, but there is no activities that we can consider as reaction, actual reaction on our webinar. So in this small element, we look through all key events that we decide as significant as reaction on our webinar, sort out, and then check whether there are any reactions or not. So, for example, if there are no reaction, unfortunately, we didn't manage to engage our lead, we lower its priority and return lead back to nurturing. And if I open this lead record again, we can see that it actually was changed to move to nurturing. And the second option, if we already engaged our lead, so we stop our follow-up process as well, because we consider that there is already engagement and we do not need automation here. And that is the second part of our automation process, like to process all attendees after webinar, follow up them, consider reaction on the webinar, and that's it. So what in result? What we get with this automation? Two main benefits. First one is time saving. Obviously, we try to automate as much as we can to focus, for example, marketing team on really important tasks that can be automated. And also we can be sure in our data quality. And for the other side, it is flexibility, because each part of this process, this automation, is open for configuration. You would like to add new message that will be sent to the attendee. It's easy, just add new template or part of template and configure in Logic Builder when it should be inserted. Or if there are some changes in whole process, for example, we would like to check something else before, not just whether the is closed enrichment task before the send follow up, we can open the Sugar BPM process and add new step in it, extending our whole automation process. So it's easily configurable just easily configurable. And what is needed to do such solution? It's obviously Sugar Core CRM system with enabled Sugar BPM to choreography, for campaign choreography, the whole process as a choreograph of whole process. And also timeline viewer to track all key business events from all channels, and the important note that track only those events that are significant for us. And logic builder to configure sugar logic, and for example to integrate with external systems like GoToWebinar. Well, I believe that is all what I want to show you today. Let me check if there are any questions. Okay, not for now questions, but if you have any, please do not hesitate to contact us. We will be happy to answer. I hope that today showcase bring you an idea how to address your lead, how to improve your lead automation, how to automate your lead processing. And thank you all for your time. Have a great day and bye bye.